So, welcome to our second discussion of Kant. Now, I'm just going to open up the first handout that I gave out last week and just glance at a couple of the major points as an reorientation. Then we'll begin with talking about what's coming in the material that we're going to read, and then read from the preface and introduction. So I'm going to share the first handout. And I don't know if anyone has their copy from last week lying around to hand. And yeah, let's start from there. Okay. So I'm going to reiterate the point that I began with. In the A preface, if I use this language of A and B, am I intelligible? Is that okay? So in the A preface, when Kant makes this remark that metaphysics was regarded as the queen of the sciences, and her rule was despotic. Right? And we have this direct parallel with what is going on with political philosophy at the time, which had begun to argue from Hobbes onwards that there are universal human rights that precede political right. And that's a revolution in thought. I mean, it's not wholly made by Hobbes. He would not have taken these steps without Machiavelli and other people, but his is the first clear articulation of that. And if that understanding of things becomes acceptable, and it has a very powerful rhetoric attached to it, obviously, then that undermines all current regimes, and hence the series of revolutions in the next few centuries. And the French Revolution following a few years after the first critique, which is attempting to affect in thought something like the equivalent of that revolution in practice. That's just a broad suggestion. I'm not reading the scholarship, so please bring up any, if I'm saying something that someone has shown to be obviously false, please bring it up. I just had a brief look at a guy called Wolff, who's at Harvard, making a very boring introduction to Kant, and he was talking about the critique of pure reason, and he said, okay, so we have two major parts, the elements and the method. And my suggestion was last week that the method is the most important part, because it tells you the whole strategy of the book. And he said, the second part is of no interest. It's the epistemology in the first 700 pages that is of interest to us as philosophers. That's if you accept all of the assumptions going back to Descartes about what a thought is, and what a being is, and what a human being is. If you don't accept those, then I think that's not true. And I think that Kant himself gives the emphasis to the second part very clearly. But I raise that because that's where a lot of the scholarship is. Just having looked at my guide to what current scholarship is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I put the link in the first handout. That's quite reliable. This is where a lot of people were at, if you look at their references. Okay, so that's just a very broad suggestion of some of the discussions that we had. So that's why I give the emphasis to Rousseau as Kant says, Rousseau set me right. Hume may have woken him from his dogmatic slumbers about the possibility of metaphysics and science, because Hume is arguing that on the basis of our experience, which is sense perception, we cannot say that there is anything necessary and universal. But that undermines the empirical science that he himself is propagating. That means Newton is out. That means science is out. These are just habits, but habits can be countered by other habits. There's no necessity and universality to, say, mathematical physics. And that also leaves out knowledge, intellectual perception of better and worse, good and bad, just and unjust. And Hume has that very vivid example of a murder. It's not inherent in the colour, the movement, the bodies, and so on. Now, that's because Hume and other moderns are challenging the classical view. They're obviously also in polemic relation to Christianity, but our interest is in the philosophy, and they're challenging the classical view that there is an intellectual perception of intelligible objects, which we're going to discuss briefly. Okay, so Hume, Rousseau. We went through the introduction, and again, by giving it the motto from Bacon and by mentioning Bacon as the origin of modern natural science. Well, he part perpetuated and in part began modern natural science. So when he's referring in the B preface to the path of a secure science, one has been going since 600 BC. Right? It's mathematics by the Greeks, because there was in some ways empirically superior mathematics available to the Babylonians and the Egyptians, but they didn't understand what they were doing. They didn't reduce it to axioms and postulates and proofs. So they didn't ground it, and Kant's intention is to ground our ordinary experience in its intelligible principles. Whether that's a legitimate enterprise is again a question. Okay, I'll go on. Okay, so, and we're going to come back to the status of mathematics, natural science and metaphysics in the B preface shortly. Now, okay, so that's just a glance back at what I had in the first handout. I don't think we yet have time to read this conclusion to the Critique of Practical Reason, but we will, because it's got a good summary of some of the things that Kant suggests. But any questions about what we ran through from that handout before we get to the text? Or any questions from last week about just other suggestions that were made that are incoherent and uninformed? And now, there is a second handout, which I probably should actually hand out. And on the front cover of it, which I'm now trying to increase in size and online.
Martin, just one confirmation, if I may.
Yeah.
So when we read sciences in this book, The Critique of Pure Reason, it's a reference, am I wrong, not just to the natural sciences as we understand them, but to all academic knowledge and, shall we say, serious inquiry.
So science is genuine knowledge, yes. And we have genuine sciences, according to Kant, of mathematics and physics. Human sciences will not have the same pure principles of those two sciences. So what we call the social sciences, he calls anthropology. But they are so imbued with empirical data and so on that they don't have the same stringency as genuine sciences of pure reason. Yeah. Now, at this point, I want to say something about this. I just mentioned the structure of this book. If you look at I've highlighted the two main parts: the transcendental doctrine of elements, the transcendental doctrine of method. And we'll be reading a paragraph today with the word transcendental in it, and we'll try and begin to understand this word, right? And again, we'll try and begin to understand some of the other main terms. But clearly, you look at the B pagination, there's 700 pages on the doctrine of elements and 150 pages on the doctrine of method. There's a clear, and that's because he's trying to make plausible in very comprehensive and complicated argument a view that is not in line with our ordinary thought, which is that we see things, we comprehend things, and our experience is made up of perception, which we may then mingle with our own reflections, passions, biases, etc. But it's upon the things that we experience. Whereas he's going to argue that the things that we take ourselves to be observing are constituted by thought itself. Our thought is not constituted by the objects that we perceive. Now, I've just put that in very brief, and we're going to read the main paragraph in the B preface where he discusses that shortly. Now, I hesitate to do this. I was going to spend 10 minutes or so discussing I was going to read a couple of paragraphs from Plato and Aristotle on the relation between the intelligible aspects of experience and thought, and the three metaphysical sciences in Aristotle. But my main aim in this course is that we read Kant together and discuss. So I will begin this, but I'll be very, very grateful if you have any suggestions. Like, no, I just want to read Kant, whether immediately or by email later. I do want the main focus is to read Kant, but I thought it might be helpful because he's going to divide metaphysics up in the B preface, and if I give some suggestions from Aristotle, then we see what he's differing from. But he's differing from the tradition of metaphysics as expressed by his predecessor in Germany, Wolff. Now, there's two references to the well-groundedness of thought in Germany in the B preface. The first is that it hasn't entirely gone away, and therefore my book can be appreciated because there's still this well-groundedness of thought. Now, his main target is the tradition of metaphysics as expressed by Wolff, but later in the preface he says that Wolff introduced well-groundedness of thought into Germany. So that's an interesting complication. He has this enormous respect for his target, but his target has been the result of many traditions of thought that have impacted upon what happens with Aristotle, which is no longer the same. But Aristotle is the source of this thought, and I thought, it just might be helpful. I'll read a couple of things and just put a couple of notes on the board. So this is from the book called The Metaphysics by Aristotle, and the Metaphysics is not a title that Aristotle chose, and it's not a word. Let me just get rid of this and pin this. Right, so the word metaphysics is an accident of the first person who put together the works of Aristotle, and the ta, meta, ta, physica are the things that follow the physics. Meta doesn't mean beyond. It can't mean beyond in Greek. It comes to mean that in the tradition, like what's beyond and because of things that Aristotle says, but his term was first philosophy, because it's the highest kind, but as he says, if it exists, it's very uncertain. And the main statement that he makes on this is in Metaphysics book Epsilon, and the first 3 chapters, but particularly chapter 1. And that's where I'm going to read a couple of lines from. Okay, so I'll just, So he begins by saying, the principles and causes of the beings are what is sought. And it's clear that we seek the principles and causes of beings as beings. So not as this kind of being or that kind of being, just the principle of beings as a whole. And then he gives some examples from medicine, from mathematics. But the way he splits it up is as follows. So since natural science happens to be about a certain genus of being, so a certain kind of being, living beings, or moving beings, for concerning such a being, the principle of motion, of motion and rest is in it, right? So there are some beings whose principle of motion is internal. The main contrast is those things that have an external principle of motion, and that category is mainly artifacts, right? That chair did not come into being by a natural growth like a tree, or it didn't fall to earth like a stone, it didn't put itself together as a living being. It's an artifact. The principle of motion is in the maker, not in the thing. So natural beings have a principle of motion in themselves. So then he says physics is that. So it's clear that physics is therefore, I'm adding words, but neither practical nor productive. For in things made, the principle is in the maker, which is the suggestion I just made. The artifacts, the things are in the maker. Whether that's intelligence or art or skill or some power. Of the practical things, the principle is in the actor, the deliberate choice. So in a human action fully conceived, like a specifically human action, not the action of a kangaroo or a tree, there's a deliberate choice that we can judge. This is his suggestion. Whereas in animals, there's more passion, or we would say instinct, and less, no capacity, no intellect. This is what he's saying. Okay, so that if both Aristotle and Kant like 35-line sentences, so you just have to hold your breath and hope for the best. So that if every dianoia, every thought, I have to do some. This is going to help with Kant because he's going to say that Aristotle is saying that every science is either he has a word which I have to explain, dianoia or dianoic. I'll just say dianoic, which is a word that has intellect, nous, in it. Intellect. But it works through what the nous gives you, and so the translation of dianoia is discursive thinking. Now, he says a science is either discursive, that's made up of propositions, discourse, that represents propositions of thought, right? Either wholly or to some degree. Now, what he means by that is that you have to have the original intuition, the intellectual intuition, the nous, to precede your discourse. Otherwise, you're not talking about anything. This is the classical view shared by Plato that our scientific discourse is about the things that we intuit intellectually, and this is the main point that Kant wants to challenge. Okay, and he's going to call this. Okay, so this you could say is reason, because reason is about inferences. We have certain data, and we infer things, we argue on the basis of these concepts that we have or that we've acquired in some way. And this would be understanding. This is the highest thing. Now, this is going to be reversed in Kant. Okay. Initially, he's going to reverse that and say the understanding provides the concepts by which we realize any experience. We have a sense perception, and then the sense perception activates the concepts of the understanding to make us think that's a chair, this is a human, that's a tree, so on. Okay, so I'm going to say yes.
Martin, if this is a complication, you can just sidestep it, but consciousness is part of modernity. So where does the idea of the modern sense of consciousness fit into Aristotle and Plato's thinking here, and then moves on to Kant?
So we're looking at the same phenomena slightly differently, so I'll just say how I see it, right? Which is that the notion that there is a mind as opposed to a body is the Cartesian innovation, and what that does is cut off the several aspects of that which animates a living being, and that which animates a living being is a whole. It's its life, right? Which includes nutrition, what Aristotle calls passions, and the intellect. And Descartes wants to reduce nutrition and passion to mechanics, to physics, and that just leaves the mind. And that's the either discovery or invention of the ego cogitans, just the thinking I that is the substance that is separate from the bodily substance. Now, so from my point of view, what we call consciousness or the self and so on in modernity is a result of this shrinking of the whole psyche, the whole living thing, to this one aspect. But let's leave that there, because we're going to have lots of chances to talk about this further, and I've already taken up far too much time with Aristotle.
I'm happy to leave it there, but that was a very helpful explanation. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks. And while I'm being somewhat discouraging about pursuing aspects of what's going on with Aristotle, definitely when we get to Kant, let's hammer each paragraph as much as we can. Okay, I don't want to take too much time with Aristotle. Just to say that, so he is saying that both, that you need the intellectual intuition of the being of a thing, and that's different from the discourse, right? That's different from our speech about a thing. The same in Plato. And also, therefore, therefore we have three sciences. I just have to do this because this is going to come up directly.
Is that intellectual intuition like the form? Or like
Of the form, yes. Yeah. So, and then we have three kinds of dianoetic sciences, discursive sciences, three forms of knowledge, and they are, he says, theoretical, practical, and productive. Now, the theoretical divides into mathematics and physics, and then if it exists, first philosophy. And if it exists, first philosophy is the highest. Now, the practical and the productive, they have changeable causes, because you, as someone acting or as someone making something, you have different desires and they change, and the artifacts change and so on. Whereas the causes of mathematics and physics don't change. Right? As long as if there are no kangaroos, then there's no causes of the motion of a kangaroo. As long as there are kangaroos, they have the same principle of motion within themselves as any other kangaroo. As long as there are human beings, they have the same principle of motions, which are a combination of passion and thought, mixed up in various ways, as any other human. So this is his thought, right? The science that focuses on the principles that are always is the highest science. Practice, that is achieving wealth and peace, is for the sake of theory. So is production, the production of a language, the production of books, the production of a society, and so on, by a statesman or a lawmaker. The practical and the productive are ultimately for the sake of the theoretical. That's the highest. Now, I've already mentioned that quote from Rousseau, theory is for the sake of practice in Kant. That's this whole revolution. Theory is for the sake of practice. By practice, he means moral philosophy, which is very different from what Aristotle means, but that simple reversal is clear. Okay, so I probably have spent too much time on that. I wanted to read a couple of quotes from Plato, but we might just go too far off track. Okay, so let's have a look at the preface. B preface. Does anyone remember when books, you could read a book and it would still be one book, and as opposed to being 25 different? This is the second copy of the Critique of Pure Reason I've used in 2 months. It's
library copy.
I should have done that, but then I would have been fined.
Make sure you can read it.
Okay, so preface. Actually, I'm just going to quickly jump to the second handout. So if you all have that here, sorry, second page, because I wanted to, my intention was we look at a very broad outline of the preface and read some pages in detail. So from the very first part of the second preface, he is discussing whether or not metaphysics can be a science. And he gives two characteristics of a science. One, it progresses and doesn't keep going backward and forward in its progress. And two, its co-workers, the people who work in the science, can reach unanimity, which are very ambiguous, very, very ambiguous signs of a science. Because knowledge, we all know that knowledge can sometimes not be popular, right? Or not be accepted for reasons apart from the acuity with which that knowledge was thought through. But anyway, that's if you're an Enlightenment teacher, you have to agree with that. Okay, and then he gives the example of logic, which is about purely the formal aspect of thinking. It can't tell you about any objects that you experience and so on. So, and that's the advantage by which it's able to make itself complete. And his suggestion is that it is complete. So it's a genuine science because it hasn't gone backwards, and everyone agrees about that until about 20 years' time, and everyone disagrees about that. But we'll ignore that historical development for our purposes. Okay, then reason in the sciences. Number 3. Insofar as there is reason in the sciences, something is cognized a priori. So our first step into the terminology. Insofar as there is reason in the sciences. So what he means is that insofar as you can say something that is true, universal and necessary, right? Then you must think something that is prior to the sense perception. For example, I'll give you I'll try and stick to Kantian examples as often as possible, but there is only one example every 47 pages, so I'm going to have to make some up. If I say those 2 chairs and those 2 chairs make 4 chairs, it's not because I've derived that from previous numbers of chairs gathered or other things gathered. It's because 2 and 2 is 4, and that's necessary and universal. It doesn't matter what I'm counting. Yeah. So if there is to be reason, something, and the origin of reason goes back to ratio in Latin, which is the proportional meaning a thing has, that is universal and visible to anyone. And it goes back to Plato and Aristotle saying that things have an intelligible aspect. They look a certain way to the mind. And any human being, in principle, could see the same thing if they weren't distorted by their, habits and passions and so on. Okay, so his claim is, insofar as there is reason in the sciences, there is something cognized a priori, and we'll see what that means in more detail in the first paragraph of the introduction. And then he divides the way in which there is a priori thinking. Theoretical cognition of reason determines the object and its concept. So instead of the object determining our intellect and our discursive intellect then thinking about what we've perceived, our discursive intellect forms the object and its concept. Practical cognition also determines the object and makes it. So, and we get to this when we get to the method, the second part of the critique of pure reason, that in morality, we actually are making the principle. So it's not the particular things you do or the particular principle, it's how it's made that makes it moral or immoral. Okay, and that's complicated, and we'll be discussing this further. Now, his thought there under number 3, I've got this. This is my division of the preface. It's not his division, so it doesn't have his authority. But he says, in both parts, in theoretical thinking and in practical thinking, the pure aspect, the a priori aspect, must be expounded by itself. And he's going to expand on what that means and why that's necessary further in the preface in which we're going to read. But to put it basically, it's like this. In theory, our reason can infer almost anything about anything. And the only principle governing it is the principle of non-contradiction. Right? If someone says something contradictory, we know that's wrong. But if they say something that's not contradictory, even if it's wildly implausible, like Leibniz's view that every being is eternal and its whole life and everything about it is determined before it existed. And so like this in the methodology, like people find that persuasive because he's a genius and he writes he's read every scientific book ever written until he existed and so on. And so but it's wild. I just don't, if you look at it from the outside, but that's because there's no ground that it's grasping onto. And what that means for Kant is that variability in what we can reason about can undermine practical philosophy. It can undermine morality. Okay, and there's a very simple reason for that. If Newton's thought is becoming more persuasive, and it was extremely persuasive to many people. And if the truth of things is matter moving in motion according to necessary laws, there is no human freedom and there's no human morality. So that a theoretical science, physics, is going to destroy practical science, morality. And the critique of pure reason is to critique reason and prevent it from doing that. Okay. Part 6. So mathematics has been around since around Thales. Right? Natural science has only been around since the time of Bacon, obviously begun with Galileo and these other people he mentioned, but it's only been around for 150 years. Aristotle, not natural science. That's just a failure. Right? All of science from Plato and Aristotle up until Galileo and Bacon, not a natural science, just mere words about fragments of the imagination. Right? It's important to grasp that this is what he's saying extremely clearly. Just because, as I mentioned in the first class, there's a tendency for intellectual disciplines especially at university, to be seen as all contributing to the same program. And that program is, of course, the interpretation of the professor lecturing us, right? But this is not how it is. We have to see how clear the boundaries are between, in this case, what a genuine science is and what a fake science is. And that brings us to, and we want to look at that example in the preface, which is at page 13 in the preface, because he's there showing us the activity of reason in a science. And we need to do that because he's going to model the metaphysical science on mathematics and physics. Now, what page number did I just say that we were going to look at? 13? 13. Okay, so I think I'm on just before 13. It's at page 180 in our translation. It's just before B13. And we read this. We're going to read it again. When Galileo rolled balls of a weight chosen by himself down an inclined plane, or when Torricelli made the air bear a weight that he had previously thought to be equal to that of a known column of water, blah, blah, Stahl did this over the page. And then the top of the next page, which is still B13, a light dawned on all those who studied nature. So he uses the same terminology for each of the three sciences, mathematics, physics, and metaphysics in this preface. He says, in the first two, there was a revolution in the way of thinking. In mathematics, 600 BC, in physics, around the time of Bacon, there was a revolution in the way of thinking and a light dawned on the people practicing that science. Now, what's the revolution in physics? That's what he's now going to articulate. They comprehended that reason has insight only into what it itself produces according to its own design. So reason produces the insight that we then subsequently have an insight into.
What is this like?
I'm sorry?
Is you reading from the...
I'm reading, from the preface, still B13. I don't know if you have access to the critique of pure reason as a text.
I think I've got it. It's in that drive thing, right?
Yeah. So on that first handout, that link should take you there. That's a handout. And I thought I had one from last week as well, but we're not talking about that at the moment. So, but at the moment we're in the middle of B13. Okay, so. So they comprehended that reason has insight only into what it itself produces according to its own design, that it must take the lead with principles for its judgments according to constant laws and compel nature to answer its questions. Okay, the sentence goes on for another 45 words, but just to pause there. Okay, so Bacon, Stahl, and Who was it?
Torricelli.
Torricelli.
Oh,
Don't read much Torricelli myself. Their presumption is that there is such a thing as a universal and necessary natural law, which you never see, right? Things act in various ways, and it's not obvious, and you can't derive from those things the absolute necessity that it always is this way. That was Hume's argument. And so Kant's reply is, yes, but the fact that we have this science, that we can make an experiment, and he adopts this language, we can make an experiment that reproduces the results of our theory every time. That's because there is a necessity, not in the empirical data that we intuit, but in the thinking that we produce, that constitutes the objects of our experience. If that's still a wildly mysterious articulation, we're going to read the same thing many times. So, okay, so then he says, rather than letting nature guide its movements by keeping reason, as it were, in leading strings. For otherwise, accidental observations made according to no previously designed plan, otherwise accidental observations can never connect up into a necessary law, which is yet what reason seeks and requires. So to reason about something is to say something that is rational, i.e. it has the same ratio or ratio or proportion or meaning in principle for anyone, always. Okay. But that can't be derived from our experience. It's in fact the framework that builds our experience. Okay, so back to Kant's actual words. Reason, in order to be taught by nature, must approach nature with its principles in one hand, according to which alone the agreement among appearances can count as laws. So, on the one hand, if you have a principle, a law of motion, right, that's the basis for the agreement among appearances, but that is not something you derive from the appearances. And in the other hand, the experiments thought out in accord with these principles. So you've got your principle, 3 laws of motion, like Newton or something. You design experiments, and the appearances help to validate your principle or show you that you should modify them. But the principles are prior to the things you observe. Now, this preface is an experiment with metaphysics. He says this explicitly. I'm going to experiment with changing our understanding of metaphysics in accordance with what they've done with natural science. And he says that in the preface, it's an experiment which proves true, right? And then later, in the transcendental deduction, he gives it apodictic proof. Apodictic is a Greek word, apodeiknumi, which means to show something forth, that is to, and it becomes translated as demonstrate, right? So he has proven or demonstrated, he has shown forth thoroughly that his revolution in thought, changing the orientation of principles and beings, is correct. This is his assertion. Okay, now that's two successful sciences, mathematics and physics, and I'm just going to read actually B14 in the margin, one line above that in the translation. He says, thus even physics owes the advantageous revolution in its way of thinking, and he uses this same phrase in the preface about 7 times. A revolution in the way of thinking. He uses it for mathematics, physics, and for what he's accomplishing in metaphysics. It owes that to the inspiration that what reason would not be able to know of itself and has to learn from nature, it has to seek in the latter, though not merely ascribe to it, in accordance with what reason itself puts into nature. Another transparent, easily understood sentence. So I'm going to go through it again. Even physics owes the advantageous revolution in its way of thinking to the inspiration that what reason would not be able to know of itself and has to learn from nature. So when you conduct a series of experiments, you confirm or deny your notion of what motion is, or your prediction of where Mars will be at 4 p.m. tomorrow, which depends upon your principle of motion and certain calculations and so on. And you can confirm or deny that, and so your experiment shows you that your principle is right or wrong, on the one hand, but next step, it has to seek in the latter, that is what it learns from nature, though not merely ascribed to it, in accordance with what reason itself puts into nature. So what we are learning, the necessary laws of motion or whatever it is that we learn from nature, we are learning not what nature itself has intelligibly, but what we as rational beings put into it. Okay, which is hard to understand, I think. But the whole introduction is designed to elucidate these points, so we'll get there. Yeah. Yeah, because my book has fallen to 55 parts, it's not easy to control the parts. I once wrote a very angry letter to Oxford University Press because they were printing the classical texts, Plato and Aristotle and Cicero, and gluing the spine. Like the only books in the universe that you absolutely must be able to read very slowly, 35 times with flat pages, and someone who was sacked from their position as manager of Coles took over and said we can save money with this. It drives me crazy. But anyway, that's
it really does drive me crazy. He's been saying that for the last 30 years.
yeah.
I agree. I make books from scratch. And
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Much more.
There's
How did you
a
learn that? How did you learn that?
I copied the message makers.
okay, so metaphysics is a failure because it doesn't meet his two criteria for a secure science. It goes backward and forward and no one agrees about anything. And that's the criteria from paragraph 1 of the preface. Now, if you go to, I'm just going to tell you, at B14, he then says, so is this because, sorry, B15, is it impossible or have we not been following the right example for how to think about metaphysics? And this is what he says just before B16 in the margin. He says, I should think, rather than it being impossible, rather than we cannot reason about first principles, I should think that the examples of mathematics and natural science, which have become what they now are, through a revolution brought about all at once. So he takes that revolution by whoever it was, Thales or whoever recorded in Diogenes Laertius, who first wrote down a complete proof from axioms of the properties of a triangle, and the assumption of natural laws of motion by Torricelli and Bacon and so on. That is a revolution, an orientation brought about all at once, which he wants to achieve with this book in metaphysics. Okay, so those examples were remarkable enough that we might reflect on the essential element in the change in the ways of thinking that has been so advantageous to them. And at least as an experiment, i.e. my book, the preface, in the preface, as an experiment, imitate those examples insofar as their analogy with metaphysics as rational cognition might permit. Okay, so now we have an articulation of the revolution in thought in metaphysics. So up till now, it has been assumed that all our cognition must conform to the objects. But all attempts to find out something about them a priori, to find out something about the objects a priori, through concepts that would extend our cognition, have, on this presupposition, come to nothing. Now, example, when he says, what is metaphysics? He says, well, the three main questions are the existence of God, human freedom, and the immortality of the soul. Now, none of those three questions play any prominent role in Aristotle's first philosophy. Just not important. This is not the focus. because they have become important because of modern natural science challenging the notion that there is human freedom, and B, Christianity, which gives preeminence to God, right? But without those two traditions, they wouldn't be central to metaphysics. So that's coming from Aristotle, that's slightly odd. That's his assertion. But then he says, okay, so the arguments, for example, for the existence of God, there are arguments that are equally rational on both sides. So reason cannot decide this question. And that's what I mean by there has been no progress by saying we can reason about this object. So instead, we're going to experiment with objects being constituted by our reason. But that's going to restrict theoretical reason purely to the objects of physics. So he says, hence, let us try whether we do not get farther with the problem of metaphysics by assuming that the objects must conform to our cognition, which would agree better with the requested possibility of an a priori cognition of them, which is to establish something about objects before they are given to us. So if we accept this notion that there must be some a priori cognition, if we accept the notion that for something to be necessary and universal, it has to be given by thought, not by the thing, because things are sensible and variable and so on, then this makes sense. Then it makes sense that you're only going to have a secure metaphysics if you take thinking to project its structure onto beings. Because then you could actually discover that science, because it's... You're right. Okay, and then we have this metaphor that's become famous in Kantian studies. This would be just like the first thoughts of Copernicus, who, when he did not make good progress in the explanation of the celestial motions, if he assumed that the entire celestial host revolves around the observer, tried to see if he might not have the greater success if he made the observer revolve and let the stars at rest. Okay, so, I mean, the chief part of this metaphor is the activity, right? The stars, there are two things. First of all, what's our ordinary experience? We are on the earth. The metaphor for something being stable is that it's well grounded, like standing on the earth. This is the stable thing. The sun moves around, the stars move around. So they're obviously in motion and we're still. That's our ordinary experience. Right? Now, when you try and calculate the motion of the stars and you mix in the planets, it becomes very hard to do that on that basis, on the fact that they're moving in a circle, because they're not moving in a circle, they're moving in ellipses and so on. Complicated. Although there's a guy called Michael Crow who writes books on the history of mechanics from Aristotle to Einstein. There's 3 or 4 different volumes. I find him quite helpful because he quotes extensively from whoever it is, Newton or Copernicus, and has arguments about these things. And he claims in his exposition of Copernicus that he's using the same mathematics as Ptolemy, who is arguing for the notion that the Earth is stable and the stars move around it, and that he didn't make any advance in mathematics. He just changed this one hypothesis, but it didn't radically simplify things, so it was still, he couldn't prove it. It's just a hypothesis. But I just find that interesting. But in any case, so the first thing is that our ordinary experience seems to suppose that we are stable and it's the objects that are moving. If we reverse that and if we say what makes more sense in our calculations of everything is we are in motion, the Earth is spinning, and we're moving around the sun, then it's the metaphor is it's the activity, the action of the mind that makes things intelligible. We're not reading the intelligibility of things off them. That's the metaphor. Okay. Okay, so he said, now in metaphysics we can try in a similar way regarding the intuition of objects. So Aristotle, as I was suggesting before, is saying there's two aspects to reason as a whole, and there is for Kant too. They both use terms that could be translated as understanding and reason. Right? For Aristotle, understanding is intuition of objects. And that's the highest thing. Reason is reasoning about those objects once we've understood them. And Kant is going to reverse this. So in metaphysics, we can try in a similar way regarding the intuition of objects. The intuition means what you take in or what is given to you, not what you have formed, not what you have made. If intuition has to conform to the constitution of the objects, then I do not see how we can know anything of them a priori. So, if what is given to us is things, beings of various kinds, then because they are individual and variable, they can't tell us anything necessary and universal. Yeah. Does this make sense? Because this is extremely important for Kant. So when he says, refers to Hume, and Hume is saying, one of his famous examples is the billiard ball. One billiard ball hits another. Right? I see that one billiard ball appears to move the other, but I don't perceive from that it's a necessary causal function, principle. I just see that this conjunction of actions happened in this case, and so I won my $20 off you in this billiard game. But that doesn't mean that it's necessary and universal. I can't derive that necessity and universality from seeing two balls hit each other. That's the suggestion. So did you want to say something before you had your...
No, I'm just... I have a thought in my mind which I was holding back to let you speak. But I might...
Do you want to just grab that? Thank you.
Say that what you're talking about reminds me of my own experience in a scientific lab.
Okay.
Where you say the current idea about this is wrong. And this other idea, and you impose it on nature. But one of my hobby horses ever since is that science doesn't prove anything. People talk about science proving stuff all the time. All it does is scientists get a good idea and they do 5 experiments, 10, 20, I don't know how many it takes, but you don't do an infinite number.
Right.
So science never proves.
Right.
Or science as we understand it, sort of lab biology or whatever.
Yeah. No, that's the perfect illustration of what Kant is saying, and in agreement with Hume and that. And in agreement with Karl Popper, who's saying science can only give you something that you can then disprove by a further experiment. There is no positive proof that this is necessarily and always the case. So all the empirical data we get it's not fully determinate. It's not universal and necessary. Yeah, so I think that's very helpful. And I think, if we start from there, then that makes Kant's first step here more persuasive. Because we're doing all the experiments under the impression that there are universal laws, right? Otherwise, why do them? Yeah?
And a lot of people do use the word proof for a scientific result. Whereas even the Big Bang, which is universally talked about, written about, has its opponents, thank God.
Right.
And that's the nature of scientific truth.
Right.
There's always some crazy guy out there, male or female, who thinks something else.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. Thank you. And that's where he's starting from. That the experiment itself can't give us the proof. He, of course, is saying, I'm experimenting in the preface, and I'll give you the proof 47 pages on. But we'll see.
Which, of course, goes back to Francis Bacon's torture of nature.
Right.
Building on his long experience with witches. He tortures witches to get the truth out of them.
Right.
If you duck them in the ducking stool and they survive, they're not witches.
Yeah. Bacon is not as stupid as that sounds, but I know that I happened to have just come across a paragraph where he endorsed torture in some case. I don't know what it was. Maybe that was one of these cases.
His boss, James I, was torturing witches and
Right.
writing a lot about it.
Okay.
I'm not telling much more about that. But
Okay.
I
Okay.
think his torturing was literal.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No. And so that's what. And we live in the light of modern natural science, which obviously brings us many, many gifts. Child, the huge reduction in the mortality of infants when they're born, and so on. Things that are great gifts, but we therefore don't often appreciate what the reorientation in the view of our ordinary experience that it requires. And part of that is, but Bacon's one of the few people who actually argues for this at length in the New Organon. What he says, the ordinary course of nature, which is Aristotle, that we experience various things of various kinds, humans, artifacts, natural beings that don't have intelligence but have nutrition and motion and so on. Like that variety, Bacon says, is an illusion. What the truth is what we now call the underlying law of nature. That is laws of motion, mechanical laws. But we have to torture nature in its ordinary course to find out what they are, which is what an experiment is. That you have to, and it comes from empiria, it's a Greek word, which means to test. But the test can be a legal test, i.e. torture, right? It depends on your social status in the law court at the time. Okay, slight digression, but yeah, that was a helpful point about where he's beginning from. Okay, so if we start from our empirical experience, then I don't see how we can know anything of them a priori. So that's 2 lines below that B17 in the margin. But if the object, as an object of the senses, so chair, human, tree, and so on, if that object conforms to the constitution of our faculty of intuition, then I can very well represent this possibility to myself. What's the possibility? How we can know anything of them a priori. So the possibility is how we can know something a priori. So if the object conforms to our faculty of thought, because it's no longer going to be intuition, then I can see how we can have a priori knowledge. Because it's our thought that forms the thing, so then we can know it. Because it's our way of thinking. And that justifies him in saying the critique of pure reason is self-knowledge, because we are learning how we constitute the objects of our experience. Do you want to...
But if our sensations are so limited and thin, then isn't Kant already... I mean, if that's the proof that they have to conform to the powers of understanding, and we've defined them as not being able to lend in any way to the understanding of the powers of the understanding, then isn't Kant just anticipating his own conclusion? Isn't this all circular?
Yes. So,
because he's assuming that all the lifting of cognition comes from cognition already because of the way he defined his terms.
Kant is going to say that reason as a whole must form a complete system.
Yes.
Hence his claim that with the first edition of this book in 1781, metaphysics has for the first time been accomplished and finished. So in the second edition, I'm going to answer this question, but in the B preface where he refers to the difference between the first and the second edition, he says the content's exactly the same, it's just a presentation. Now, 8,000 scholars are going to say he's wrong because there's all these changes in the arguments and so on. But that's his claim, that reason has to be a complete system given once. Remember how he says that, a revolution that took place all at once, a reorientation of thinking in the case of mathematics and science, natural science, and in metaphysics. It has to be a reorientation that occurs all at once because thought has its own principles and is a complete system. Now, a system, it comes from a Greek word, systemi, which means, in all of our languages we have ST sounds for stand. Histemi in Greek, stehen in German, stor, stare in Latin, and so on. But this ST is Indo-European, very deep, and it means to come to a stand, to be upright. Sus, well, it comes from sun, means together, so to stand together. So a system is something that stands together as a whole and can be understood as a whole, right? But it's not dependent on something else, right? Now, if thought is a system, then it doesn't matter where you start, you're going to end up with the whole system. It sounds like Parmenides. It doesn't matter where I begin. But yeah, and so he says, I don't know where it is, page 757 or something, that as a system, the argument is necessarily going to be circular because it all stands together as a whole. We just have to make our way into that circle at some point and fully agree, and as he says, become sub-workers of his project. That was the last part of the preface. Or we can disagree, so feel free. We will be disagreeing later on. Okay. We should have a break. We've read an entire page. And, so, yeah, we come back. I'm going to be much more selective with the rest of the preface, and we'll just begin to read the introduction. We're doing so. Aristotle says, if there are no objects of theoretical contemplation, then physics is first philosophy. So he is saying, if first philosophy, or what we call metaphysics, exists, he raises that. That's the question that he's dealing with in the book that we, by tradition, call the metaphysics. Now, I take it that Aristotle thinks he does establish that there is a metaphysics. But Kant is saying, no, Aristotle and everyone who thinks they've been engaged in metaphysics up until me is wrong. It's been a delusion. It's been, he says, it's been a groping about, right? Only I have put it on the secure path of science. So for the first time, there is metaphysics. Now that his metaphysics, his transcendental metaphysics, which is what he describes it as after the introduction, destroys the possibility of what the entire tradition thought was metaphysics. Okay, now I think we're in agreement. So I will return to the text. So it's 127. We'll just spend 10 more minutes on the preface and go to the introduction. So we're on page 17, B17 in the margin. And he's just said if intuition has to conform with the constitution of the objects, I don't see how we can know anything a priori. Okay. Yes.
When he's talking about a position that he's trying to move away from intuition conform to the constitution of the objects.
Yes.
Is there an example, or maybe I've missed the example that you've given, where the constitution of the objects are imposing their order on?
Okay, let me make a very simple. Okay, so this is my suggestion with no authority because we're not going to get any examples for a while. Okay? So what he is calling experience and what is the same as what he calls phenomena. That's experience. And that is a mix of two things. One, sensible objects, sensible intuition, sensibility, let's say. And either concept or being. And I'll give you an example. E.g., a dog, right? So a dog is going to have certain colours, certain height, but what it is, its being is, it's a dog. That's an intellectual aspect of it. Now, where does that aspect come from? Aristotle, the being is the essence of the dog, informs the dog, and our mind is like a mirror that reflects that being. So our intuition, our intellectual intuition conforms to the being of the thing, and we think, we realise that being dog in its form in our mind, and then we can discuss it, we can name it a dog, we can describe its attributes and so on. Is that?
Is that the concept of eidos that I've heard of?
Yes, that's the eidos, or the being of the thing, right? Now Kant says, I absolutely agree with you, Aristotle, in ordinary experience, that a dog is made up of these two aspects, the intelligible aspect and the sensible aspect. Complete agreement. But I'm saying that this concept of a dog is constituted by the understanding. The understanding being the main aspect of what? That was a mistake. The understanding being one of our two faculties of cognition or reason. Yeah. We constitute the being of the thing when it's aroused by the sensibility, by the sense perceptions. Whereas, so this is his revolution in as simple as possible. But I think that this is exactly what he's saying, and I think this agrees with even the scholarship and so on, that what he's saying is that what Aristotle is saying is that there is intellectual intuition of the character, the being, the intellectual aspect, the eidos of the thing. The mind reflects it. This is why in Plato and Aristotle, the first aspect of the mind is like a mirror or something that doesn't have any character itself, but that merely takes on the character of the thing that is seen. Right? Whereas Kant is saying that's impossible. The understanding has to be roused by some sensed object, but then the understanding itself forms the necessary and universal concept that characterizes that thing as a dog or a tree or a chair. So that's why he's saying, we change our orientation. The revolution is the object. The mind doesn't conform to the object. The mind constitutes the object. The understanding constitutes the object.
Is there then a part of experience that is not accessible for Kant? Like he talks about the thing in itself. Is that below or beyond even like the sensible?
Okay, I'm going to say something very broad, which I can't justify in the text thus far. But if the mind constitutes the object, then the object itself becomes a placeholder. It's just an empty word, because we don't have any contact with that. We have contact with what the mind has constituted. So that means there's now the phenomena, the dog, and the thing in itself, which he uses. The term he uses is noumena, which is the Greek for the thing intellected with the nous, which is, and precisely for him, it's precisely what is not intellected. We cannot contact the noumena in any way because there's no intellectual intuition, right? So we've made the phenomena with our nous. We have no contact with the thing in itself. But the key is this: how do we form our various and diverse sense perception into necessary and universal laws of thinking, so that I always recognize a dog, I always recognize a chair? The mind has to have a certain freedom or, quote, spontaneity, so that it forms things, so it's spontaneous or free, but always in accord with universal laws. We're stretching way ahead into later passages, but just to make this one point. Now, but if that's the case, then that means that the metaphysics that save Newtonian science from the fact that all cause is just habit and so on, there's not just sense of data, there are necessary laws, the mind always forms itself in accordance with these laws. If we have saved Newton, we have also preserved the thing in itself as something not known by that science, and that can be the realm of morality. There could be actual, genuine contact with the truth of things in the moral sphere. So he has saved both the science and human freedom and morality. This is the claim. But I don't want to enter into that now because we're reading this page. Right? Okay, so B17.
I suppose, though, just on that point there, for Kant, would Aristotle be viewed as a scientist
Total failure.
or as,
As
a,
an-
or
as a-
as a philosopher?
As a mystic.
Is a failure.
Like in the sense that,
No, it's
that he had this view
yeah.
that, if I'm understanding this correctly, that intuition conforms to the constitution of object.
Yes.
But that view was I suppose, a scientific as well as a metaphysical view.
So he totally fails to be a scientist because he does. To put this very simplistically, he does not subscribe to the notion of a mathematical, therefore universal natural law. So he can make plenty of empirical observations. Human beings do this in the political and ethical works, and observations about biology in his 6 biological books. Some of them might be very accurate and useful, but he hasn't been able to make it into a science because he hasn't got to the principles which are given by the mind, not in the thing. So I think he would say he's not a scientist. He may be very good in some empirical areas. I don't have authority for that, but I do know there's a later work where he's criticised. I was reading it because I wanted to see what he said about Plato. And he said Plato is Schwärmerei, enthusiast and mystic. But Aristotle actually gets down to work because I mean, if you read Aristotle, every line is this carefully ordered understanding of things. The order is not always immediately apparent, but but it's not on scientific principles. Yeah. Now, if we're on page 17. Where do we want to be? Yeah. I want the beginning of a sentence. That's all. Just at page 18. Actually, no, we have to read the sentence before. Unfortunately, the sentence before is a page and a half long. I'm going to start from, I can assume either that the concepts through which I bring about this determination also conform to the objects, and then I am once again in the same difficulty about how I could know anything about them a priori, or else, so this is his assumption, I assume that the objects, or what is the same thing, the experience of a dog, say, in which alone they can be cognized as given objects, conforms to those concepts, in which case I immediately see an easier way out of the difficulty, since experience itself is a kind of cognition requiring the understanding, whose rule the understanding provides rules for thinking. So it's spontaneous, but in accordance with rules. So it's both free in one sense, but it gives you necessary truths in another, right? Oil, water, whose rule I have to presuppose in myself before any object is given to me, hence a priori, which rule is expressed in concepts a priori, concepts that are prior to sensible experience, to which all objects of experience must therefore necessarily conform and with which they must agree. That was half a sentence, right? Let's press on. As for objects insofar as they are thought merely, okay, so that would, but he deliberately said there, understanding, right? So our experience of the dog is given by, what is given in that experience is what's sensible. That rouses the understanding to provide concepts to form it into something that is always true for that sense experience. It's a dog. It's always true, and it's necessarily true, and it's true for everyone who sees it. It's a dog. That's the understanding which provides the concepts for our sensible experience. Now he's going to go to the reason, and reason is different from understanding. Right? Okay, so as for objects, insofar as they are thought merely through reason. So this is just under B18 in the margin, just one line under. And necessarily at that. But that, at least as reason thinks them, cannot be given in experience at all. The attempt to think them, for they must be capable of being thought, will provide a splendid touchstone of what we assume as the altered method of our way of thinking, namely, that we can cognize of things a priori only what we ourselves have put in them. Okay, so that makes hardly any sense. I mean, just, on the surface, it's just difficult. So therefore, let's look at the footnote. This method, imitated from the method of those who study nature, as I suggested 2 pages back, that's what we should be doing, thus consists in this: to seek the elements of pure reason, reason without experience, in that which admits of being confirmed or refuted through an experience. So, confirmed, that's extremely important, yes, not just refuted like Karl Popper, right? Confirmed or refuted through an experiment. Now, the propositions of pure reason, especially when they venture beyond all boundaries of possible experience. For example, he's going to say later on that if you rely on pure reason without experience, you end up with necessary contradictions. I have my necessary rational proof that a God exists, my necessary rational proof on agreed premises that a God cannot exist. I have my rational argument that the cosmos has a beginning at a certain time. I have my equally rational argument that cannot begin at a certain time and it must be eternal. So if you rely just on pure reason without experience, you end up with contradictions. But the only thing governing reason is the principle of non-contradiction. So that means reason is in trouble. It produces things that make no sense. Now, the proposition...
That's the whole idea of antinomies.
Yes.
And I don't know how to pronounce it.
Antinomies.
Antinomies.
Yeah, that's right, exactly right. Now, it's when they venture, so pure reason, when they venture beyond the propositions of pure reason, when they venture beyond all boundaries of possible experience, admit of no test by experiment with their objects as in natural science. So if I use, principles of motion derived from the concepts of the understanding to say Mars is going to be there tomorrow at 4 p.m, I can test that a priori principle of motion by seeing if Mars is there. But I can't do that with, is the cosmos eternal, or did it start 13.8 billion years ago? Well, at least difficult to arrange. Okay. So therefore, thus, to experiment will be feasible only with concepts and principles that we assume a priori by arranging the latter so that the same objects can be considered from 2 different sides. On the one side, as objects of the senses and the understanding for experience. So on the one side, we have things that are physical, dogs, artifacts, stones. So we get sense data and the understanding cognizes or constitutes them in a certain way for us. That's on the one side. On the other side, as objects that are merely thought, at most for isolated reason, striving beyond the bounds of experience. And I'm going to show you that those things don't exist. They don't exist as objects of theory, of knowing. What's going to change is he's going to say that some of these things must be postulated for the sake of our moral knowledge. But we come to that later. But for the moment, from the theoretical side, all of that is delusion. If we now find that there is agreement with the principle of pure reason when things are considered from this twofold standpoint, but that an unavoidable conflict of reason with itself arises with a single standpoint, then the experiment decides for the correctness of that distinction, i.e. my proposition is proven. So this is the experiment. We're going to look at things as if they have these 2 aspects. One, the physical aspect, that things are constituted by the concepts of our understanding when sense perception arouses that understanding. And on the other hand, reason, which without experience is off in the ether and cannot show us the truth of these things. That's the immediate standpoint. Now, Kant says, where are we? I'm going to have to go back to page 18 from where that footnote originated. And there's a paragraph between page 18 and 19 where he says, this experiment succeeds as well as we could wish, and it promises to metaphysics the secure source of course of a science in its first part, right, the understanding and the sensibility, where it concerns itself with concepts a priori to which the corresponding objects appropriate to them can be given in experience. So this experiment in what metaphysics is succeeds insofar as we understand the objects of our experience, which just means anything physical, but including the being of that thing, like dogs, trees, and so on. It succeeds insofar as we understand things as constituted by concepts aroused by sensibility. I'm using aroused because you used that in the introduction. Okay, so that succeeds that far in the first part. For after this alteration in our way of thinking, we can very well explain the possibility of a cognition a priori, and what is still more, we can provide satisfactory proofs of the laws that are the a priori ground of nature as the sum total of objects of experience, which were both impossible according to the earlier way of proceeding. So according to the earlier way that the mind has to reflect the beings, we could never say that there's a universal law, and that undermines our science. Whereas if we say that the understanding provides those universal laws, then we can say that there's a science. I'm simplifying, but now, sure.
Just appreciating that, you know, Kant is laying all this out in a very ordered way, and it has to be this order, and but I still just want to ask at this point, what part of this is pure?
We get to pure at the beginning of the introduction,
Okay.
but what he is saying is, if you have a universal law of motion,
Yeah.
that's, well, okay, what's pure? Mathematics is pure because it's not at all sensible. It's only intellectual. It's only cognition.
And are there aspects of intuition that are pure, like space and time? Are they the pure parts?
Yes.
Can you pick out parts of all of this cognitive infrastructure and say that part's pure, that part's pure? Is that?
Well, he does that, but it takes 375 pages. But
Yeah,
so in the sensibility, so there are a priori
Yeah.
means before experience,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And pure means free of sensible experience.
Okay.
There are actually a priori pure principles of our reception of sensible things, dogs, chairs, cats, right? And they are time and space, which are not things. The mind does not receive time and space as objects. They're not objects. They are the context that an object is given to us as a human being. It must be perceived as a temporal and spatial being. So a body with aspects and being and so on, but it's a body, yeah. But so time and space are therefore ways of cognizing. They're not things that are known.
Yeah.
So we constitute things in time and space because that's our way of perception. Okay, back to Kant. Okay, now, the very last, in the translation, this is the last line of page 111. In the German it's B19, about halfway down, he says, but from this deduction of our faculty of cognizing a priori in the first part of metaphysics, so this notion that things are constituted by the understanding and the sensibility, there emerges a very strange result, and one that appears very disadvantageous to the whole purpose with which the second part of metaphysics concerns itself, namely, that with this faculty, reason, no longer the understanding, with reason, we can never get beyond the boundaries of possible experience, which is nevertheless precisely the most essential occupation of this science. Right, so if the metaphysical questions are freedom, God, the humans, and the psyche, right, you don't have sensible perception of those things. So the disadvantage, if our concepts relate to physical things, we have no contact with the psyche as an immortal being. There's no physical contact with that, or with God, or with freedom. Like that's not empirical data, right? Then that appears as if metaphysics is out, but he's going to save everything. So relaxed. Stay relaxed.
Could I answer?
Please. Yeah.
I think I'm understanding the definition that you've given, that's given in the key terms.
Yep.
Second handout.
Yep.
That a priori cognition is cognition that is independent of all experience.
Yes.
However, what I can't quite understand is how cognition, which occurs in time and has a sort of phenomenal appearance, at least to our thought and understanding,
Yeah.
can be said to be outside of experience or not given in experience.
Okay, so let's read the first paragraph. Where it says on the handout, it's the third page, and this is the very first paragraph of the introduction. We'll go back to the preface, but I think hopefully this will help us understand this better. So this is, all I've done is copy out the first paragraph. There is no doubt whatever that all of our cognition begins with experience, which is what you're expressing. Yeah. So in time and space, we experience things. For how else should the cognitive faculty be awakened into exercise if not through objects that stimulate our senses? How else are we going to think that that's a dog and this is a chair if there's not some object to stimulate us to think that, right? To stimulate our senses and in part themselves produce representations, in part bring the activity of our understanding into motion, to compare these, to connect and separate them, and thus to work up the raw material of sensible impressions into a cognition of objects that is called experience. So this is what I'm saying. This is why I'm saying that the experience is the cognized thing. It's the dog or the chair. And what he's saying here, he's beginning to break that down and say that the dog or the chair gives us certain sensible data. It stimulates our senses that in part produce the representations of that's red, this is grey, and so on. We begin to, as he says, to connect and separate. So I'm connecting the red parts together. I'm separating the red from the grey, and I'm seeing those as different kinds of material, plastic and whatever, fabric. So we have to connect and separate in order to make the thing as a whole, right? The thing as a whole is the experience, and it's got two parts. One, that's sensible construction or production of representations, and part two is the activity, not the passive understanding, the activity of the understanding, which is set in motion and which in this process works that raw material into a thing, into an object. So the argument is Aristotle right in saying that no, we cognize the thing and then try and speak about it, or Kant is saying no, you end up in all kinds of problems. The only way we can genuinely have knowledge, always that's necessarily a chair, is if we, by a rule of the understanding, pronounce that a chair. If our understanding must cognize that in a certain necessary way. Now, so the next sentence is, as far as time is concerned, and that's his bold, right? Then no cognition in us precedes experience. There's nothing a priori, temporally or in time, but that's not the key point. The key point is not that our cognition of these things starts when we see it. The key point is that what is prior in the sense of more important in making it a thing, making it a specific being with a specific characteristic. And that, he is saying, is not what is given, but what is produced. Yeah. So as far as time is concerned, no cognition precedes experience, and with cognition, with experience, every cognition begins. If you don't have something to stimulate the senses, there's no cognition. But the key point is not when it begins, but what's prior in forming it. Yeah. So then the next line is, although all our cognition commences with experience temporally, yet it does not on that account all arise from experience. We don't derive the character, the being of the thing from it, We constitute it. That's the claim. Let's continue with this. I've tried to summarize with some quotes. So we'll just continue this first section of the introduction. Then he raises a question: is there any cognition, quote, independent of all experience and even of all impressions of the senses? That is, are there any cognitions a priori? So is there any thought that is, for example, what constitutes a dog, right? Or what constitutes a motion, or what constitutes, anything, prior to the sensible experience. And that's what he means by a priori, as opposed to an empirical cognition.
So it'd be like platonic forms or something.
No, because platonic forms are seen. And we're saying, is there thinking a priori? Not is there perception of something, but is there a constituting thinking?
Okay, yeah.
Now, so B, clarification. Cognitions are often called a priori that rely on experience, right? They're not a priori in the pure sense. And he says, if you undermine the foundation of a house, it'll collapse. And he says, you could have known that a priori. But that a priori means you could have known that on the basis of other experience, that things will tend to fall down and that foundations are necessary for houses, which requires experience of houses. So that's not a pure a priori thought. That's not pure of all experience. And he says, no. So what I want is, so see, Kant says in this book, I will use the term a priori only to mean cognitions that occur, quote, absolutely independently of experience, or that are, quote, pure, so pure of experience. And some, he says some a priori cognitions are not pure, quote, every alteration has its cause. Why? Because we have to experience alterations to understand the concept alteration. And that experience is already constituted by the fact that everything that occurs is caused by something else. And so we derive that in part from experience. Every alteration has its cause. So part 2. So this is the second chapter of the introduction. We are in possession, actually it's 156. And I think there are some people coming in here at 2. So I'm going to have to end a couple of minutes before 2 p.m. And I've left precisely 37 seconds for any questions, suggestions. And what?
I'm just thinking about forms being seen. My understanding, like in the sort of Phaedo, for example, doesn't Plato say that basically go beyond all the senses, the forms are underground beyond any sense contact. So when he says use the word seen, that's seen by the mind and the pure realms.
This is okay. We have to go a long way here because I take those mythological expressions to insist upon the distinction between sensible and intelligible, but not that there are two separate places, because a place, there can't be two separate places because place belongs to sensibility. So it's the intelligible character of the one place that he's trying to make sense of. And he expresses himself mythologically or poetically because you can't express you can't express discursively and scientifically the grounds for there being any knowledge, or which is the formal intelligible aspect of things. But we would be having a long conversation to get through that, unfortunately. And we should follow up. We're going to have to shut down. And
another very good class, Martin. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. We didn't make quite the progress that we. So I will email an even more modest and abbreviated, or slightly less insane reading suggestion for next week. But please be in touch with emails and questions and objections. And I'll see you next week.
We got through more than 8 weeks. So.